If only I had as rich a good and rich accent as Veronica, we'd be all set, right? Anyway, it's good to see many of you all again, and thanks for the warm welcome and welcoming me back to the SRIC annual event and to a great roundtable that we had this afternoon already on the issues of healthcare. The organizers had asked me in the beginning to say make a couple of comments about projects that we've talked about previously, and I'll do that in a very general way, but I think they can also come up later in the program, if that's okay. I basically had two things I wanted to say, and first, a quick update on some projects at the Vatican that I've mentioned a number of times and a number of you asked me from time to time about. There are a set of ethical investment guidelines in preparation. They're much further ahead than they were this time last year, and will hopefully see the light of day pretty soon. You won't be surprised by what's in there, but I think ought to be able to celebrate the fact that they will elevate the voice of the church at a global level on the issues that many of you have worked very hard on for any number of years here at SRIC and the community at ICCR in New York and the many other faith traditions as well. So I think that's going to be important to be celebrated and to welcome when it does see the light of day. I think there's very specifically in relationship to that a set of guidelines that we've been preparing for the Vatican Bank and for the Asset Management Department of the Vatican Bank. I know the Vatican Bank makes a lot of news. There are any number of books written about it and any number of stories told. Even up until recently it was in the news on a couple of occasions since January 1st. So I think that's also something to look forward to. They've worked very hard and trying to balance, I think, the kinds of conversations we've had here in recent years and that many of your communities continue to have. They're about human rights, they're about the environment, but they're also about genetically modified organisms, about climate change, about extractives and mining, and about healthcare. So we'll get to welcome those as well. And then finally, there is another document that we should see the light of day pretty soon. That is a compilation. There was a book published the other day, actually, a compilation of Pope Francis's thinking and teachings thus far on Catholic social teaching and the financial system. It's in Italian, but I suspect will get translated pretty quickly. But off of that, there's also a more formal document coming out either out of the Secretary of State or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on that same subject. This is near and dear to my heart because I think it's been one that many have been encouraging the Vatican to look at and to consider doing for a good while. We know that they move very quickly over there on all the issues that we're very concerned about. But this is one that goes to the heart of the issue that SRIC is involved in. Anybody who's involved in investments, anybody who's involved in considering and trying to understand either the financial system or the individual financial transactions and commercial transactions that are part of the commerce and the everyday living of all of us. So it would begin at least to try and lay out some vision and articulate some guiding principles going forward. I suppose somewhere between what we often talk about as free market capitalism and a more centralized social economy that is being debated and discussed in many places. But because this is a topic and an issue that the Church has written about often and talked about often in maybe broad and general terms, Many have been pushing for a bit more clarity on some of the specific issues, but also a bit clearer direction in some of these areas as well. So those are 3 items that I've mentioned here before that hopefully will see the light of day here before the end of this year, that I think would be a rich resource for the kind of work that you do and for anybody involved in financial services and asset management ought to be paying attention to. I wanted to mention one other thing, and this relates to, I think, one of the topics that we have been wrestling with at ICCR, certainly, but it was highlighted this past week very clearly for us in Washington and for anybody who is looking at C-SPAN. Did any of you watch any of the hearings with Mark Zuckerberg on Capitol Hill? Raise your hand if you did. Oh, good. You did. So, the issue of the five of the biggest tech companies in the world has certainly been on our agenda. And for those of you who don't have it at the tip of your finger, that's Amazon, Alphabet, Apple, Microsoft, and I forgot one already. Google. No, it's Alphabet. So, there's one more out there, but it'll come to me anyway. I think, listening to the hearings in the last 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, and listening to the commentary and reading the articles that have been written on this subject in recent years, but more recently in the last 3 or 4 months, how important and how pivotal an issue this is, and how important it is not just for investors, whether to invest in Apple or Amazon or Microsoft. That's an important question in its own right. But this opens up a whole other window in terms of the work that you and your congregations have been doing over the years, and a whole level of discourse and communication and intermediation that's really very important. When you think about the fact that Facebook has a market capitalization of about $480 billion, right? That's double the size of the market capitalization of Walmart, right? Walmart has about 1.1 million employees in the United States, right? And we measure that very clearly because we all know who Walmart is, and we all know where their stores are and all the stuff, the stories that are out there. Facebook has a little north of about 20,000 employees, although I'm sure you heard Mr. Zuckerberg assure senators and congressmen that they were hiring 20,000 more in the coming months to handle the questions related to Cambridge Analytica and the privacy question. But so it begs the question, I think, largely, what is the added value? What is the product? What is the good that Facebook is creating relative to society? Mr. Zuckerberg started out by saying he created Facebook to do 2 things. Do you remember what they are? He wanted to bring people together and build community. Starting in his little dorm room up there at Harvard. Great and admirable ideals and vision and objectives. And we realized that in a very short amount of time, this is a company that has grown to its present size and has any number of people engaged in it, using it, and raising any number of the kind of questions and concerns that were raised in the hearings on Capitol Hill on Tuesday and Wednesday. And if you didn't listen to any of them, I don't want you to start watching them at night after dinner, because you might fall asleep quickly from some of the exchanges. But I would recommend that you do consider looking at some of them, because I think it's a key and pivotal issue, as I've said, in relationship not only to technology companies and to Facebook and the other players in the space, but to our direction as societies and where we're going in terms of our relationships with one another. Second thing I simply want to say about it is very simply that I know this is probably going to convince some of you not to look at Facebook. Do I dare ask you How many of you do have a Facebook account? About the same as may have watched parts of the hearings. I'd encourage you at least not to let this present controversy push you away from it. In terms of its capacity and in terms of its utility and in terms of what it may bring to the kind of mission that I know most of the organizations in this room are involved in, it is indeed a very important and can be a very significant tool that can, like all tools and all technology, can be used for good and can be used to disrupt and to create confusion. But it does need our attention, it does need us to engage, it does need us to think about the kind of questions that are out there, as I think made a lot of people think about their data, how much they reveal, how much they put on there, what kind of walls need to be built between some of the things that are shared and not shared. That's fine. But it does create this other levels of community and communication that are extremely important. And aside from, I think, as I said, I think the Facebook-Walmart comparison is clearly a larger systemic question in terms of the model, the business model, but also how wealth and value is created and what corporations bring to society, how we measure it and how we value it. So that's the end of my little speech, because I think it may come up in some of the conversations in relationship to healthcare, right? I don't know about you, but for years I've been wondering if I go to 2 or 3 doctors, why I need to call up one to send the x-ray to the other. Or I have a blood test in one place and it doesn't seem to work in the other place. Or it doesn't seem to have all the right parameters related to it. And then on the other hand, I'm now seeing doctors' offices that I go into, and I see some young people taking out their phone and scanning the code, and there's all sorts of information seemingly exchanged without filling out another one of those forms that they gave me one the other day at the dentist. They said, we want you to update the medications you're taking. And I said, well, can I do that? I don't remember half of them, first of all, I said. And secondly, then you're going to want to know how strong they are and when they changed and the rest of it. It seems to me there ought to be some benefits that can be taken from technology into that field, but that's a very minor piece. I think it's the questions of what technology and how tech companies and how data will inform what we're trying to do in terms of building better health systems and healthcare systems going forward is extremely important. So let's go to the program that we have.
Séamus?
And I think, yes?
Excuse me, I just need to want to make an announcement.
Sorry.
We're going to adjust the lights, and I didn't want to startle you,
Oh.
so they're going to get dark.
That's very good. Good. Done.
Thank you, Séamus.
I have the honor of introducing Robert Ferrer, his MD. He's Professor and Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at UT Health San Antonio, practicing family physician with interests at the interface of primary care and public health, the topic that we discussed this afternoon as well, including primary care transformation, social determinants of health, and understanding complex systems. All yours.
All right, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be with you all this evening. The preamble was certainly engaging and stimulating, and I hope to continue us along that path. As Father Séamus said, I'm a family doctor. I work at the Health Science Center. And after my medical training, I decided that they didn't teach us enough about the world at large. So the first thing I went and did was a public health degree right after that, and then started my work in medicine and public health. And over time, it's sort of migrated a little bit more towards the public health side and a little bit less towards the clinical side. So I've been rebalancing according to my interests and what I think the needs of the community are. So, top right button, is that right?
You're on.
Oh, okay, there it is. I was looking up there and I wasn't seeing it. So, I'm going to do my job tonight as sort of setting up the conversation. We're going to talk about health investing. It's important to know what health is and where it comes from. And it seems like an obvious question, but for a long time, we've really conflated the conversation about health with healthcare. And I'm going to make, I think, a very convincing case with one slide about where that's gotten us. But I want to challenge you all to think hard about what is health and where it comes from. And my argument, as a physician, is going to be very sort of contrary to the arguments that you might hear that physicians usually make in public about what's going to get us where we need to be. Let's see, let's try this. Right arrow, there's an up arrow and a down arrow.
On the top, is right arrow, left arrow.
Oh, that one, okay, gotcha. That arrow. All right, so this is the history of the developed countries for about the last 50 years or so, and the graph shows two things, and it's probably a little light for the people in the back. The light gray bars on the left side show the trajectory of life expectancy in most of the developed countries in the world. And the red line shows the trajectory of health spending in the United States graphed against its life expectancy. So you can see that the history of the developed world in the last 50 years has been to spend more and more on healthcare and to have a longer and longer life expectancy. A dramatic increase over that period of time, which obviously has a lot of human benefits, because when you live longer, it means often you've been healthier later into your life, and so you can work longer, you can enjoy your grandchildren longer, you can follow your spiritual pursuits longer, whatever it is that interests you, you get to do in better health, and that's clearly important. There's one outlier on the graph, and that's us. So about 1980, we started to leave our developed country siblings behind in terms of health spending. And now we spend about 1.5 to 2 times as much as many of those countries. What do we get for it? In that same time period, we also started to diverge from our sister developed countries in terms of life expectancy. So that we fall about 4 or 5 years behind the best performing countries in the world these days. Now, is 4 or 5 years a lot? It is. In these public health statistics, a few years is a lot. For example, people estimate that if we took cancer off the slate of human maladies, the life expectancy in the United States would increase about 3.5 to 4 years. Why so little? Because if you don't die of cancer, you're going to die of something else when you're 87. But still, that's a major difference in the life expectancy in those countries. So, what is the value we're getting for this endless trajectory of health spending increases in the United States? Judged by that, and by the performance of what other countries are able to do, I would argue not very good at all. And if we're going to talk about investment, we're getting a poor value for investment in terms of the $3 trillion health budget that we have. We'll go to a smaller scale now. This is, you recognize this. This is Bear County, San Antonio inside. This is the life expectancy by zip code in our county. If you were attentive readers of the Express News, you saw this a couple of years ago. We had the Health Collaborative, which is a nonprofit I work for, or don't work for, but I'm part as a volunteer. We asked the health department to put this together for our city so we could understand what some of the disparities were. Again, life expectancy being the most stark disparity that we can talk about. And I think probably everyone in this room knows this, that the center city, the south side, has a much lower life expectancy than the north side, up to 20 years, which is, we're not talking 4 years anymore, we're talking about 20 years. So that's the difference between, seeing your grandchildren and not grow up, right? So very meaningful to people in their lives. So we live in a society where this is normal. We could show this kind of graphic for just about any major city in the United States, and it would look very similar. The geographic distribution would be different depending on where they put the highways and where the growth is and the affluent parts of town are. But the fact that you would see these huge disparities is true everywhere. I want to show you a graph that we don't often show. I dug this out of the archives at UTSA. This is from the 1930s. After the Great Depression, as the country started to recover, people who wrote mortgages had to decide which neighborhoods they were going to make lending in, write mortgages for, and which neighborhoods seemed too risky, because the people in them were too poor, bad credit risks, etc., and they weren't going to offer mortgages to those folks. The red zone here is places that were redlined, which meant that the instruction to the mortgage bankers was do not write mortgages in those areas. Do not evaluate people's credit history, not be careful, do not write mortgages in those areas. And this map is a slightly different scale than the San Antonio map, but if you were to lay the life expectancy, poor areas from the other map on the red zones here, they would match up very, very closely. So you might ask, well, that was 80 years ago. What is the mechanism by which that might happen? Why would that still be reverberating today? And the answer is not so mysterious. If you think about how lower and middle class people build wealth, how do they do that? Right? They're not in high-paying jobs, but what they do is they pay into a mortgage for 30 years. And over that time, they create capital in their home that then, as they retire and maybe go to a different place, don't need the house anymore, they pass on to the next generation. And then that generation starts with a little more money and passes it on to the next generation. So that complete disinvestment in those communities had ripple effects that we can still read today in life expectancies of our citizens. All right, we're going to come down even another level of abstraction here. So this is an X-ray. This is an X-ray from the inpatient service, the hospital service that I work on, of a kid, young guy, 25 years old. I took care of last year. He's 25 years old. He's had type 2 diabetes since he was 15, okay, which is a new invention of our time. When I went to medical school, if you saw a teenager with type 2 diabetes, the professor would call everyone in and say, come and look at this. You're never going to see this again. It's very rare. And now it's hard to walk down the street on the west side without seeing people with that same illness. He weighed 250 pounds when he was 15 years old, and been on that trajectory ever since. Type 2 diabetes, followed soon thereafter. And obviously, upstream from the diabetes epidemic is the obesity epidemic, which I'll talk about in a minute very briefly. But the reason his X-ray looks that way is he lost his second toe, was amputated